Picture this, a 16-year-old girl kneeling in fresh snow, her bare hands pressed against the bloodied fur of a massive wolf, whispering words her grandmother taught her in a language most folks had forgotten. The wolf's amber eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment, she made a choice that would change everything. This isn't just a story about survival on the frontier, it's about finding your true family in the most unexpected places. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The wind cut through Pine Ridge territory like a blade, carrying the scent of coming snow across the endless Montana wilderness. Maya Carson pulled her wool coat tighter as she stepped onto the porch of the Carson Ranch, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid December air. The ranch stretched before her like a monument to loneliness, weathered fence posts marking boundaries that seemed to hold nothing but emptiness, and a barn that echoed with the ghosts of better days. Her father Joseph had been different since her mother died 3 years ago. Where once there had been conversation over morning coffee, now there was only the scrape of his chair against wooden floors, and the sound of his boots heading toward the door before dawn. He spoke in grunts and nods, measuring his words like they cost him something precious. The ranch had become a place where two people lived completely separate lives under the same roof, sharing space, but not warmth. Maya had learned to fill the silence with her own routines. She tended the horses with a gentleness that seemed to calm even the most skittish mares. She mended fences with the patience her mother had taught her, taking time to do things right rather than fast. Most importantly, she spent hours walking the creek beds and forest paths, learning the language of the wilderness that surrounded their isolated home. Her mother had been different from other frontier women. Born to a Cheyenne mother and a Scottish trader, she had grown up between two worlds before marrying Joseph and settling into ranch life. She had taught Maya things that other girls didn't know: how to read animal tracks in mud, how to identify healing plants by their leaves, and how to listen to the stories the wind carried across the plains. But most precious of all, she had taught Maya the old healing songs, the ones that seemed to reach something deeper than words. Joseph Carson had loved his wife's gentle spirit, but after her death, everything that reminded him of her became too painful to bear. He stopped speaking Cheyenne words around the house. He packed away the beadwork and the medicine bundles. He forbade Maya from wandering too far from the ranch, claiming it wasn't safe for a young woman alone. But safety, Maya had learned, wasn't always about staying close to home. That morning, as she watched her father ride toward the north pasture without so much as a glance in her direction, Maya felt the familiar ache of being seen but not recognized. He looked at her and saw her mother's dark hair, her mother's careful way of moving through the world, her mother's habit of humming while she worked. But he never seemed to see Maya herself, the girl who had inherited not just her mother's appearance, but her deep connection to the living world around them. The ranch felt smaller every day, like the walls were closing in on a life that had never really been hers to begin with. She had overheard Joseph talking to Doc Brennan in town the previous week, mentioning California, mentioning selling the land, mentioning a fresh start where memories couldn't follow them. Maya understood that in her father's mind, she was both the most precious thing he had left and a daily reminder of everything he had lost. She finished her morning chores with mechanical precision, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, checking the water troughs, but her mind wandered to the forest beyond the fence line. There was a restlessness in her that grew stronger each day, a feeling that the life she was living was too small for what her spirit needed. Her mother used to say that some people were born to build walls and others were born to cross them. Maya was beginning to understand which kind of person she was. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted ground, but the warmth never seemed to reach her. She could hear her father's voice carried on the wind, calling to the cattle in the distance, and she knew he wouldn't return until supper. The house stood empty behind her, clean and orderly and hollow as a church on Monday morning. Maya made a decision that felt both impulsive and inevitable. She pulled on her heaviest boots, wrapped her mother's old shawl around her shoulders, and headed toward Willow Creek. The path was familiar beneath her feet, worn smooth by years of walking. But today it felt different. Today it felt like the beginning of something, rather than just another way to pass time. The creek ran clear and cold between banks lined with frost-covered willows. This was where her mother had taught her to identify animal tracks, where she had learned that every creature had its own way of moving through the world. Maya followed the water downstream, her eyes scanning the ground for signs of life in the winter landscape. It was the sound that stopped her first, a low whimpering that seemed to come from the direction of the old beaver dam. Maya froze, listening, her heart beginning to beat faster. The sound came again, weaker this time, carried on the wind like a prayer that had lost its way. She found him lying in a shallow depression beneath a fallen cottonwood tree, his silver gray fur matted with blood, his powerful frame reduced to trembling vulnerability. The wolf was massive, easily the largest she had ever seen, with amber eyes that tracked her movement as she approached. Blood had pooled beneath his right shoulder, where something had torn through muscle and sinew, leaving a wound that spoke of violence and desperation. Maya's first instinct was to back away. She had been taught that wolves were dangerous, unpredictable, not to be trusted around humans or livestock. But as she looked into those amber eyes, she saw something that overrode her fear, a recognition that passed between them like a spark jumping across space. This was not a monster or a threat. This was a living being in desperate need of help. She knelt slowly in the snow, her hands empty and visible, speaking in the soft tone her mother had used with injured animals. The wolf's ears pricked forward, and though his body remained tense, he did not try to move away. Maya could see that movement would be impossible anyway. The wound was severe, and loss of blood had left him weak and shivering, without fully understanding why. Maya began to hum one of her mother's healing songs, the melody rising and falling like water over stones. The wolf's breathing seemed to steady, his amber eyes never leaving her face. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the strip of clean cloth she always carried, a habit her mother had instilled in her years ago. Working slowly and speaking continuously in both English and the Cheyenne words she remembered, Maya began to clean the wound. The wolf flinched but did not snap, as if he understood that she meant no harm. Blood had frozen in places, creating a mixture of ice and damaged tissue that required gentle patience to address. As she worked, Maya felt something shifting inside her chest, a recognition that this moment was important in ways she couldn't yet understand. Her hands moved with a confidence that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her conscious knowledge, guided by instincts that felt both foreign and familiar. The healing songs her mother had taught her seemed to flow from her lips without effort, creating a rhythm that matched the wolf's breathing. When she had done everything she could with the cloth and the small amount of water from her canteen, Maya sat back on her heels and looked at the wolf seriously. The bleeding had slowed, but the wound was deep and would require more care than she could provide here in the forest. The wolf would need shelter, warmth, and time to heal, things that could only be found back at the ranch. The practical part of her mind immediately began listing all the reasons why this was impossible. Her father would never allow a wolf on the property. The neighbors would consider it dangerous madness. Doc Brennan would probably suggest she be examined for head trauma. But the deeper part of her, the part that had inherited her mother's gifts, knew that walking away was not an option. Maya stood and brushed snow from her knees, her decision made even before she fully acknowledged it to herself. She would find a way to help this wolf, regardless of the consequences. As she prepared to make the journey back to the ranch to gather supplies, the wolf made a sound, not quite a whimper, not quite a growl, but something that sounded remarkably like gratitude. She turned back to meet those amber eyes one more time. "I'll be back," she whispered, the words carrying a weight of promise that surprised her. "I won't leave you here to die." The walk back to the ranch felt different than the walk out had been. Maya's mind raced with plans and possibilities, calculating how to move an injured Wolf without causing more damage, where to hide him while he healed, how to keep her father from discovering what she was doing. But beneath the practical concerns, there was something else, a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life for longer than she cared to remember. She gathered supplies with methodical care, clean bandages, healing salve that Doc Brennan had given her for the horses, a thick blanket, and strips of dried meat from the pantry. She also took her mother's medicine bag, the one her father had packed away but never quite managed to throw out. Inside were herbs and roots that her mother had harvested and prepared, their healing properties still strong after 3 years. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when Maya made her way back to Willow Creek, her arms full of supplies and her heart full of determination. The Wolf was still conscious when she returned, though she could see that he was weaker than before. His breathing was shallow, and his amber eyes seemed to take longer to focus on her face. Working by the fading afternoon light, Maya cleaned the wound more thoroughly and applied the healing salve with gentle pressure. She wrapped the shoulder with clean bandages, speaking continuously in the soothing tones her mother had used. The Wolf endured her ministrations with remarkable patience, as if he understood that she was trying to save his life. When she had finished the medical care, Maya spread the blanket beside the Wolf and helped him shift onto its warmth. The movement caused him obvious pain, but he managed it without snapping or showing aggression. Maya found herself amazed by his trust, by the way he seemed to accept her help as if it were the most natural thing in the world. As darkness began to settle over the forest, Maya realized she faced another decision. She could return to the ranch and come back in the morning, hoping the Wolf would survive the night alone. Or she could stay with him, keeping him warm and monitoring his condition, but risk her father's anger when she failed to return home. The choice was easier than she expected. Maya arranged herself beside the Wolf, sharing the blanket and using her body heat to keep him warm. She had spent enough nights alone in her room at the ranch to know that loneliness was its own kind of cold. Tonight, for the first time in years, she would sleep beside another living being who needed her presence. The Wolf's breathing gradually steadied as warmth returned to his body. Maya found herself matching her breath to his, creating a rhythm that seemed to belong to both of them. As sleep began to claim her, she felt the Wolf shift slightly, moving closer to her warmth. His massive head came to rest near her shoulder, and she could feel the steady beat of his heart against her side. In that moment, lying beneath a canopy of stars with a wounded Wolf pressed against her for warmth, Maya felt more at home than she had in her own house for 3 years. Whatever consequences awaited her in the morning seemed less important than this, the simple act of providing comfort to another living being, the profound satisfaction of answering a call for help that had nothing to do with duty or expectation. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was the distant howling of other wolves, calling across the darkness to their missing pack member. The sound was both lonely and beautiful, a reminder that even in the vast wilderness, no creature was ever truly alone. Maya smiled and pulled the blanket closer around both of them, understanding for the first time that family was not always about blood or law or tradition. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sometimes it was about choosing to stay when you could walk away, about offering warmth when the world had grown cold. Morning would bring challenges she couldn't yet imagine, decisions that would change the course of her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, beside a creature who had needed her help and trusted her enough to accept it. The healing had begun, though Maya didn't yet realize that the wolf was not the only one who had been wounded, and that sometimes the act of saving another's life was really about finding your own. Dawn crept across Pine Ridge territory with the reluctant pace of winter morning, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. Maya stirred beneath the shared blanket, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar weight pressed against her side. Then memory flooded back, the wolf, the wound, the choice she had made to stay through the cold night. She opened her eyes to find amber ones watching her, alert and intelligent, holding a depth of awareness that made her breath catch. Silver, as she had begun thinking of him during the long hours of the night, had improved dramatically. His breathing was steady and strong, no longer the labored gasps of the previous evening. The bleeding had stopped completely, and though she could see pain in his eyes when he shifted position, there was also something else, a spark of life that had been barely flickering when she first found him. Maya sat up carefully, mindful not to disturb his injured shoulder. The morning air bit at her exposed skin, but she felt more awake and alive than she had in months. There was something about spending the night in the wilderness, about being needed by another living creature, that had awakened parts of herself she had forgotten existed. The ranch and its suffocating routine felt like something from another lifetime. She checked Silver's bandages, pleased to see that they remained clean and properly positioned. The healing salve had done its work during the night, drawing out infection and promoting the body's natural mending processes. Her mother's medicine bag had contained treasures Maya was only beginning to appreciate, roots and herbs that carried generations of healing knowledge, prepared by hands that understood the deep connections between all living things. Silver watched her movements with the patience of a creature who had learned to trust. When she spoke to him in the mixture of English and Cheyenne that came naturally to her, his ears moved forward in response. There was an intelligence in his gaze that went beyond simple animal instinct, a recognition that seemed to bridge the space between their different worlds. As the sun climbed higher, Maya realized she faced a decision that would define everything that followed. Silver was too weak to travel far, but remaining here beside Willow Creek left them both exposed to dangers she could not control. Her father would have discovered her absence by now, and his reaction would depend entirely on his mood and the level of worry her disappearance had caused. But beyond her father's anger lay a more immediate concern. Silver needed continued care, proper shelter, and regular meals if he was going to survive. The old line shack came to her like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. Located nearly 2 miles from the main ranch house, deep in the pine grove that marked the eastern boundary of their property, it had been abandoned for years after her father had consolidated the cattle operations closer to home. Maya remembered it as a small but solid structure, built to shelter ranch hands during the winter months when they needed to check on distant herds. The shack would provide everything Silver needed: 4 walls, a roof that didn't leak, and most importantly, isolation from prying eyes. Maya had helped her father repair the building several years ago, so she knew it still contained basic furnishings and a functional fireplace. It would mean she could care for Silver properly while keeping their secret safe from a world that would not understand. Moving Silver would require careful planning and considerable effort. He was massive, easily weighing more than she did, and his injured shoulder would make any movement painful. But Maya had learned patience from watching her mother work with injured animals, had absorbed the understanding that healing could not be rushed, but also could not be ignored. She began by talking to Silver in the calm, steady voice her mother had used with frightened horses. She explained what needed to happen, why they had to move, where they were going. Logic told her that a wolf could not understand human language, but instinct suggested otherwise. Silver's responses, the positioning of his ears, the focus of his attention, the subtle relaxation of his body indicated a level of comprehension that defied conventional wisdom. When she gently encouraged him to stand, Silver managed the movement with obvious effort, but without complaint. He was weak, favoring his injured side heavily, but the determination in his amber eyes matched her own. Maya positioned herself beside his uninjured shoulder, offering support without trying to control his movements. Together, they began the slow journey through the forest toward the line shack. The trek took most of the morning. Maya had to stop frequently to allow Silver to rest, using the pauses to offer him water from her canteen and small pieces of dried meat from her supplies. Each rest period gave her opportunity to check his bandages and monitor his condition. The wolf endured everything with a stoicism that impressed her, never showing aggression despite his obvious discomfort. When the line shack finally came into view through the pine trees, Maya felt a surge of relief that threatened to overwhelm her. The small building looked exactly as she remembered: weathered logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that rose straight and true, windows that had been boarded over but could easily be opened to let in light. It was humble and isolated, but it was shelter. The door protested on rusted hinges, filling the forest with a squeal that made Silver's ears flatten against his head. Inside, the shack smelled of dust and abandonment, but the structure was sound. A simple wooden bed frame occupied one corner. A rough table and chair sat beneath the boarded window, and the stone fireplace dominated the wall opposite the door. Cobwebs draped the rafters like abandoned decorations, and a thin layer of dust covered every surface. Maya settled Silver on the pile of blankets she arranged beside the fireplace, then set about making the space habitable. She cleared the chimney of debris, swept the floor with a broom made from pine branches, and opened one of the windows to let in fresh air and natural light. The physical work felt good after the tension of the morning's journey, and she found herself humming the healing songs her mother had taught her. Silver watched her preparations with alert interest, his amber eyes following her movements around the small space. When she built a fire in the fireplace, he repositioned himself to take advantage of the warmth, and Maya noticed that his breathing had become even more relaxed. The combination of shelter, warmth, and her continued presence seemed to be working a kind of magic on his recovery. By midday, Maya had transformed the abandoned line shack into something approaching a comfortable refuge. She had brought additional supplies from her earlier trip to the ranch: more blankets, medical supplies, food for both of them, and her mother's medicine bag. The space felt almost cozy now, filled with the soft light filtering through the window and the gentle crackling of the fire. Maya prepared a meal of broth made from dried meat and herbs, offering the liquid to Silver in a shallow pan. He drank eagerly, and she was encouraged to see his appetite returning. Recovery from such a severe wound would take time, but all the signs pointed toward healing rather than decline. The wolf's natural vitality, combined with her mother's medicines and her own careful attention, seemed to be winning the battle against injury and infection. As afternoon settled over the forest, Maya realized she could no longer postpone the inevitable confrontation with her father. He would have spent the morning searching for her, growing more worried and angry with each passing hour. Her absence overnight was unprecedented. She had never failed to return home without explanation, had never disappeared without leaving word of her whereabouts. She prepared to leave Silver with reluctance, building up the fire to ensure he would stay warm, and leaving fresh water within easy reach. The wolf seemed to understand that she was departing temporarily rather than abandoning him. When she knelt beside him to check his bandages one final time, he pressed his massive head against her hand in what felt unmistakably like gratitude. The walk back to the main ranch took her through familiar territory, but Maya felt like she was seeing it with new eyes. The pine trees seemed more alive, the sky more vast, the very air more charged with possibility. Something fundamental had shifted inside her during the past 24 hours, and she knew there would be no returning to the person she had been before finding Silver at Willow Creek, Joseph Carson was waiting on the porch when she emerged. From the tree line, his weathered face set in lines of worry that had hardened into anger during her absence. He stood when he saw her approaching, his hands clenched at his sides, his entire posture radiating the kind of controlled fury that made the air itself feel dangerous. Maya climbed the porch steps with deliberate calm, meeting her father's glare. Without flinching, she had spent the walk home preparing for this confrontation, choosing her words carefully and deciding how much truth she could reveal without compromising Silver's safety. The conversation that followed would set the tone for everything that came after. Joseph's voice was low and tight when he finally spoke, each word measured and sharp. He demanded to know where she had been, why she had failed to return home, what could possibly have justified causing him such worry. Maya listened to his questions without interrupting, understanding that his anger came from fear rather than mere irritation. She was all he had left of his former life, and her disappearance had reminded him how easily loss could visit their isolated world. When he finished speaking, Maya told him a version of the truth that she hoped would satisfy his concerns without revealing too much. She explained that she had discovered an injured animal near Willow Creek, that she had stayed overnight to provide care, that the creature had needed immediate attention that could not wait for morning. She spoke of her mother's teachings about healing, about the responsibility that came with having such knowledge. Joseph's reaction was everything Maya had expected and feared. He spoke harshly about the dangers of the wilderness, about the foolishness of a young woman spending the night alone in the forest, about responsibilities and proper behavior, and the necessity of thinking before acting. His words carried the weight of 3 years of accumulated grief and worry, all focused on the daughter who reminded him daily of everything he had lost. But beneath his anger, Maya detected something else, a grudging recognition of the same stubborn compassion that had characterized her mother. Joseph had fallen in love with a woman who could not walk past suffering without offering help, who saw connections between all living things that others missed. Now he was confronting the reality that his daughter had inherited more than just her mother's appearance. The argument that followed was sharp but brief. Joseph demanded that Maya promise never again to disappear without explanation, never again to risk her safety for the sake of wild animals, never again to prioritize the needs of creatures over her own security. Maya listened to his demands and gave him the only promise she felt she could keep honestly, that she would be more careful, more thoughtful about the risks she took. What she did not promise was to abandon Silver. What she did not reveal was the location of the line shack or the extent of her commitment to the wolf's recovery. These truths remained locked inside her, precious secrets that felt too fragile to expose to her father's fear and anger. Maya had learned that some kinds of love required protection from the very people who claimed to care about you most. That evening, as she prepared a simple supper for herself and her father, Maya's mind remained focused on the line shack and its recovering occupant. She calculated how often she could visit without arousing suspicion, what supplies she would need to maintain Silver's care, how long his healing might take. The logistics were complex, but her determination was absolute. Joseph ate his meal in brooding silence, occasionally glancing at his daughter as if trying to read her thoughts. Maya met his gaze calmly, projecting the kind of dutiful compliance he wanted to see while concealing the revolutionary changes taking place in her heart. She had crossed a line during her night beside Willow Creek, had committed herself to a path that diverged sharply from the one her father had mapped out for their life together. After supper, Maya retired to her room with the excuse of fatigue from her night in the forest. In truth, she needed time alone to process the magnitude of what she had undertaken. Caring for Silver would require more than medical knowledge and good intentions. It would demand a level of deception and resourcefulness that felt foreign to her naturally honest nature. But as she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the wind, moved through the pine trees beyond her window, Maya felt no regret for the choice she had made. Silver's amber eyes haunted her thoughts, filled with an intelligence and trust that demanded her best efforts in return. She had found something beside Willow Creek that went beyond simple compassion. She had discovered a connection that felt like recognition, like coming home to a part of herself she had never known was missing. The days that followed established a rhythm that became both natural and nerve-wracking. Maya rose before dawn to complete her ranch chores with efficient speed, then made her way to the line shack with supplies and medicine carefully concealed in a worn leather satchel. Silver's recovery progressed steadily under her care, his strength returning as his wound healed and his trust in her deepened. Each visit revealed new aspects of the wolf's remarkable intelligence. He learned to anticipate her arrival, positioning himself near the window where he could watch for her approach through the trees. He cooperated with medical procedures that must have been uncomfortable, seeming to understand that temporary discomfort served a larger purpose. Most remarkably, he began to respond to the healing songs Maya sang during his treatments, his breathing synchronizing with the ancient rhythms her mother had taught her. Maya found herself looking forward to these daily visits with an intensity that surprised her. The line shack had become a place where she could be completely herself, where her connection to her mother's teachings felt natural rather than forbidden. Silver's presence filled a loneliness she had not fully acknowledged, providing companionship that asked nothing of her except honesty and care. The wolf's personality emerged gradually as his health improved. He was playful in subtle ways, occasionally bringing her interesting objects he found around the shack: a perfectly round stone, a pinnacone with unusual symmetry, a piece of weathered wood shaped like a bird in flight. He was also protective, positioning himself between Maya and the door whenever she arrived, scanning the forest beyond the windows for signs of potential threats. Most importantly, Silver seemed to understand the precarious nature of their situation. He remained completely silent during her visits, never howling or making sounds that might carry through the forest to unfriendly ears. This restraint felt deliberate rather than coincidental, as if he grasped the necessity of keeping their relationship secret from a world that would not approve. Maya's deception required constant vigilance and careful planning. She varied her routes to the line shack to avoid creating obvious trails through the forest. She cached supplies in multiple locations to reduce the risk of discovery. She developed plausible explanations for her frequent absences from the ranch, citing the need to check distant fence lines and water sources. Her father noticed the changes in her behavior, the renewed energy, the sense of purpose that had been missing from her daily routine, the subtle return of confidence that reminded him painfully of his late wife. But Joseph attributed these improvements to the natural resilience of youth rather than to any specific cause. Maya's careful performance of dutiful compliance convinced him that their confrontation had achieved its intended purpose. 3 weeks after finding Silver at Willow Creek, Maya arrived at the line shack to discover that the wolf had made a remarkable recovery. His wound had healed cleanly, leaving only a thin scar beneath his thick fur. His strength had returned completely, and his movements showed no trace of the painful hesitation that had marked his early days of recovery. Silver was, by all measures, ready to return to the wild. The realization hit Maya with unexpected force, bringing a mixture of joy and devastating loss. She had succeeded in her goal of saving Silver's life, but success meant saying goodbye to the most meaningful relationship she had experienced since her mother's death. The thought of returning to her isolated existence at the ranch, of losing the daily companionship that had brought such richness to her world, felt almost unbearable. Silver seemed to sense her emotional turmoil. As she sat beside the fireplace, struggling with the implications of his recovery, the massive wolf approached and laid his head in her lap. The gesture was so gentle, so clearly intended to offer comfort, that Maya felt tears she had been holding back for months finally begin to fall. She wrapped her arms around Silver's neck, burying her face in his thick fur, breathing in the wild scent that had become as familiar as her own. The wolf remained perfectly still, allowing her to hold him as long as she needed, offering the kind of unconditional presence that required no explanation or justification. When Maya finally lifted her head, she found Silver watching her with those remarkable amber eyes that seemed to see straight into her soul. In that moment, she understood that their bond had become something that transcended this simple relationship between human and animal. They had saved each other in ways that went far beyond physical healing, had found in each other something that neither had known they were missing. The question now was whether that connection was strong enough to survive Silver's return to the wild, or whether their time together had been merely a beautiful interlude in lives that were destined to follow separate paths. Maya looked into Silver's eyes and saw her own uncertainty reflected there, along with something else, a possibility that had not yet been spoken, but was beginning to take shape in the space between them. The decision to release Silver back into the wilderness should have been simple, but Maya found herself inventing reasons to delay his departure. She convinced herself that he needed another few days to regain full strength, that the weather was too harsh for him to travel safely, that his scar tissue required additional monitoring. Each excuse felt reasonable in isolation, but together they revealed a truth she was reluctant to acknowledge. She was not ready to let him go. Silver seemed to understand her reluctance without judging it. He accepted her continued visits with patient grace, neither pushing for freedom nor showing signs of restlessness despite his complete recovery. His behavior suggested an unusual contentment with their arrangement, as if he too found value in their daily companionship that transcended simple gratitude for medical care. Maya began bringing books to the line shack, reading aloud during the long winter afternoons while Silver rested beside the fire. She had discovered that he responded to the rhythm of spoken language, his breathing shifting to match the cadence of poetry or the dramatic pauses in adventure stories. Her mother's journals, filled with observations about plants and animals and the changing seasons, seemed to particularly capture his attention. The intimacy of these shared hours felt precious beyond words. Maya had never experienced the simple pleasure of reading to someone who listened without interruption or judgment. Silver's presence gave weight to her words, made her feel that her thoughts and interests mattered to another living being. The line shack had become a sanctuary where time moved differently, where the pressures of the outside world seemed to hold no power. But their peaceful routine was disrupted one gray February morning, when Maya arrived to find Silver standing at the window, his entire body tense with alertness. His ears were pricked forward, rotating slightly as he tracked sounds she could not hear. Every line of his posture spoke of predatory focus, the kind of intense concentration that preceded action. Maya approached the window carefully, following Silver's gaze through the trees. At first she saw nothing unusual, just the familiar landscape of pine and snow, the natural patterns of shadow and light that she had memorized during weeks of daily visits. Then movement caught her eye, subtle but deliberate, about 50 yards from the line shack. A man was moving through the forest with the careful step of someone trying to avoid detection. Maya's heart began beating faster as she recognized Jake Morrison, one of her father's ranch hands. Jake was known for his quick temper and his suspicious nature, traits that had made him unpopular with the other workers, but valuable to Joseph Carson as someone willing to investigate problems others might ignore. Maya watched Jake circle the line shack at a distance, examining the snow for tracks, studying the smoke rising from the chimney with obvious interest. She realized with growing alarm that her careful precautions had not been careful enough. Someone had noticed her frequent absences from the ranch, had perhaps followed her through the forest, had discovered the secret she had worked so hard to protect. Silver remained motionless beside her, but Maya could feel the coiled tension in his powerful frame. The wolf's instincts had identified a potential threat, long before her human senses had registered the danger. Now they stood together at the window, predator and protector, watching an enemy who did not yet know he had been detected. Jake's investigation was methodical and thorough. He examined the cleared path to the door, the wood pile Maya had accumulated for the fireplace, the small cache of medical supplies she had hidden beneath the eaves. His expression grew more suspicious with each discovery, and Maya knew it was only a matter of time before he decided to investigate the interior of the building. The moment Jake began approaching the door, Maya made a decision that felt both desperate and inevitable. She opened the window as quietly as possible, creating an escape route, then turned to Silver with urgent whispers. The wolf needed no encouragement. He flowed through the opening with liquid grace, disappearing into the forest like a shadow released into darkness. Maya followed moments later, climbing through the window and dropping into the snow just as Jake's heavy footsteps reached the porch. She pressed herself against the wall of the line shack, listening to the creak of hinges as he pushed open the door. Through the thin log walls, she could hear him moving around inside, examining the evidence of occupancy with growing certainty. When Jake emerged from the building, his face wore the expression of a man who had confirmed his suspicions. Maya remained hidden in the shadows, watching as he mounted his horse and rode toward the main ranch with obvious purpose. She knew that within the hour, her father would know everything, or at least everything that Jake had been able to piece together from the physical evidence. The ride back to the ranch house felt like a journey toward execution. Maya's mind raced through possible explanations and excuses, but she knew that her careful deceptions had finally reached their limit. Jake's discovery of the line shack, combined with the clear signs of regular occupancy, would raise questions that could not be answered without revealing the truth about Silver. She found her father waiting in the kitchen, his face set in the kind of controlled calm that had always frightened her more than open anger. Jake stood beside him, still wearing his coat and boots, his satisfaction at exposing her secret clearly visible in his expression. The confrontation Maya had been dreading for weeks was finally at hand. Joseph Carson's voice was quiet when he spoke, but his words carried the weight of profound disappointment. He asked her direct questions about the line shack, about her activities there, about what she had been hiding from him during her frequent absences. Maya answered as honestly as she could without mentioning Silver, explaining that she had been using the building as a private retreat, a place where she could read and think without interruption. But Jake Morrison was not satisfied with partial truths. He described finding medical supplies, bandages that had clearly been used, evidence of something or someone requiring ongoing care. His questions grew more pointed and aggressive, pushing Maya toward revelations she was not prepared to make. The ranch hand's suspicions had crystallized around the possibility that Maya was secretly meeting with someone, perhaps one of the young men from town, or even someone from the local Cheyenne bands. The suggestion that she might be romantically involved with a secret lover seemed to both relieve and anger her father in equal measure. Relief that her deception did not involve more serious dangers was mixed with fury at what he saw as reckless behavior that could compromise her reputation and their family's standing in the community. Joseph's questions became more pointed, demanding names and explanations that Maya could not provide without destroying her credibility entirely. Maya's refusal to offer specific details only deepened her father's suspicions. Jake Morrison seized on her silence as confirmation of his theories, suggesting that action needed to be taken to protect both Maya's honor and the family's reputation. The ranch hand's eagerness to involve himself in their private affairs revealed motivations that went beyond simple concern for Maya's welfare. The argument that followed was unlike any Maya had experienced with her father. 3 years of accumulated grief and worry erupted in accusations and demands that felt designed to break down her defenses entirely. Joseph spoke of trust and responsibility, of the dangers facing young women who made foolish choices, of his duty to protect her even from herself. Maya listened to his words with growing understanding of how completely their perspectives had diverged. Her father saw her behavior as reckless rebellion that needed to be controlled and corrected. She experienced it as the first meaningful connection she had found since her mother's death, something precious that deserved protection, even at the cost of honesty with the people she loved. When Joseph finally demanded that she promise to stop visiting the line shack entirely, Maya felt something inside her crystallize into absolute resistance. She could not make that promise without abandoning Silver, could not give up the relationship that had restored purpose and joy to her isolated existence. Her refusal to comply transformed their argument into something more fundamental, a battle over who had the right to determine the shape of her life. The deadlock might have continued indefinitely, if not for the sound that interrupted their confrontation. Through the kitchen window, across the snow-covered yard, came a howl that seemed to originate from the direction of the line shack. The sound was haunting and beautiful, rising and falling with complex variations that spoke of intelligence and intention. Jake Morrison's reaction was immediate and dramatic. He grabbed the rifle that hung beside the door, his face lighting up with the prospect of violence. Wolf sign had been reported throughout the territory for weeks, and several ranchers had lost cattle to predation. The bounty on wolf pelts made them valuable targets, and Jake had been hoping for an opportunity to prove his skills as a hunter. Maya's heart stopped as she realized that Silver was calling to her, somehow understanding that she was in distress and offering what comfort he could provide. The wolf's howl spoke of loyalty and connection that transcended species, a bond that had developed during their weeks together in the sanctuary of the line shack. But to Jake Morrison, it represented only opportunity and profit. Joseph Carson's face had gone pale as the implications of the howl became clear. The evidence Jake had found at the line shack, the medical supplies, the ongoing care someone had been providing, suddenly made terrible sense when combined with the presence of wolves in the area. His daughter had not been meeting a secret lover. She had been doing something far more dangerous and incomprehensible. Maya watched her father struggle to process this new understanding, saw the moment when parental concern transformed into something approaching horror. In Joseph's world, wolves were threats to be eliminated, predators that killed livestock and endangered human life. The idea that his daughter had been intentionally associating with such creatures challenged everything he believed about safety and proper behavior. Jake Morrison was already moving toward the door, rifle in hand, when Maya made a choice that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She stepped directly into his path, blocking his access to the outside, her small frame suddenly radiating a determination that stopped him in his tracks. Her voice was steady when she spoke, though her heart was pounding with terror for Silver's safety. She told Jake that if he wanted to hunt wolves on Carson property, he would need her father's explicit permission. More importantly, she made it clear that she would not allow him to use information he had gained through spying on her to pursue his own agenda. The confrontation between Maya and Jake crackled with tension that went beyond the immediate question of wolf hunting. The ranch hand's assumption that he could override her authority on her own family's land revealed attitudes about power and gender that Maya had absorbed without question until this moment. Now facing the prospect of Silver's death, she found herself challenging assumptions that had shaped her entire life. Joseph Carson found himself caught between his daughter's unexpected defiance and his employees' eagerness for action. Part of him wanted to support Jake's proposal to eliminate what appeared to be a genuine threat to their livestock. But another part recognized something in Maya's desperate resistance that reminded him painfully of her mother's fierce protection of creatures others dismissed as worthless. The standoff was broken by another howl, closer this time and accompanied by answering calls from different directions. Maya realized with growing alarm that Silver was not alone in the forest. Other wolves had joined him, perhaps drawn by his calls or responding to some communication she could not understand. What had begun as a simple rescue of an injured animal had somehow evolved into something larger and more complex. Jake Morrison's excitement at the prospect of multiple targets was clearly visible in his expression. Wolf pelts were valuable enough individually, but a coordinated hunt could potentially eliminate an entire pack and earn significant bounty money. He began talking rapidly about organizing other ranchers, about tracking the wolves to their den, about the opportunity to solve the predation problem permanently. Maya listened to his plans with growing horror, understanding that her weeks of secrecy had inadvertently created a situation that threatened not just Silver, but every wolf in the territory. Her attempt to save one injured animal had somehow placed an entire pack in danger from hunters who saw them only as targets rather than living beings worthy of respect. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. She had wanted to help Silver return to his natural life, but instead her actions had drawn attention that could prove fatal to the very family he belonged to. The choices she made in the next few hours would determine whether her compassion had ultimately served life or death. Joseph Carson was studying his daughter's face with the careful attention of a man trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become urgent. Maya's distress at Jake's hunting plans went far beyond normal concern for wild animals. Her reaction suggested a personal investment that transformed the situation from abstract policy into immediate crisis. When her father finally spoke, his voice carried a new quality of careful consideration. He told Jake that no hunting would take place on Carson property without his explicit permission, and that such permission would not be granted until he had time to fully understand the situation. The ranch hand's obvious disappointment was tempered by recognition that crossing Joseph Carson directly would likely cost him his job. Maya felt a wave of relief that gave her the strength to continue standing, though she knew the reprieve was only temporary. Her father's decision to delay action rather than prevent it entirely meant that Silver and his pack remained in danger. She had bought time, but time alone would not be enough to ensure their safety. As Jake Morrison reluctantly left the house, his rifle returned to its place beside the door. Maya found herself alone with her father for a conversation that would determine everything that followed. Joseph's eyes held questions that demanded honest answers, and Maya knew that her ability to protect Silver depended on her willingness to reveal truths she had guarded so carefully. The afternoon light was fading toward evening when Maya finally began to tell her father about Silver, about the morning she had found him bleeding beside Willow Creek, about the choice she had made to save his life rather than alert the authorities. She spoke of her mother's teachings about healing, about the songs and medicines that had helped Silver recover, about the bond that had developed between them during weeks of careful nursing. Joseph listened without interruption, his expression cycling through disbelief, concern, and something that might have been reluctant admiration. Maya's story revealed a level of dedication and resourcefulness that impressed him even as it terrified him. His daughter had not only defied his explicit instructions about avoiding dangerous situations, but had done so in service of something he could barely comprehend. When Maya finished speaking, the kitchen fell into silence broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the whisper of wind around the house. Father and daughter sat across from each other at the worn wooden table, separated by differences, an understanding that felt almost insurmountable. But beneath their disagreement lay a foundation of love that had survived 3 years of grief and misunderstanding. Joseph Carson's response, when it finally came, surprised Maya with its thoughtfulness and complexity. He spoke of his fears for her safety, of the responsibilities he felt as her only remaining parent, of the impossible balance between protection and freedom that had consumed his thoughts since her mother's death. But he also acknowledged something. He had been reluctant to admit that Maya's connection to her mother's heritage was not something he could simply forbid or ignore. The conversation that followed stretched deep into the evening, covering territory that had been unexplored since the funeral 3 years earlier. Maya learned that her father's restrictions on her wanderings had been motivated by terror rather than control, that his silence about her mother's teachings had been an attempt to spare Maya from discrimination rather than to deny her heritage. Joseph revealed his own struggles with the isolation of ranch life, his own questions about whether their current existence honored her mother's memory or betrayed it. The life they had built together was safe and predictable, but it was also smaller than what either of them had imagined for themselves. Maya's story about Silver forced him to confront the possibility that safety and meaning were not always compatible goals. By the time they rose from the table, something fundamental had shifted between them. Maya had not received permission to continue her relationship with Silver, but she had gained something equally valuable, her father's acknowledgement that their current life was not sustainable, and that changes were necessary regardless of the risks they might entail. The howls that drifted across the snow-covered ranch as they prepared for bed carried new significance for both of them. Joseph heard in them the call of a wild world that his daughter understood better than he did. Maya heard Silver's voice, reaching across the darkness, reminding her that some connections were too strong to be broken by human fears or expectations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but tonight marked the end of secrets between father and daughter. Maya's honesty about Silver had opened a door to conversations that had been impossible during 3 years of careful silence. Whether that honesty would ultimately protect Silver or condemn him remained to be seen, but Maya knew that she could no longer face the future alone. Dawn broke with an unusual stillness that seemed to hold the entire world in suspension. Maya woke to find frost patterns on her bedroom window that looked like delicate feathers, as if the night had painted messages she was meant to decipher. The conversation with her father had left her feeling both lighter and more burdened lighter, because the weight of secrecy had been lifted, but heavier because Silver's danger had become immediate and real. She dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Joseph already seated at the table with a cup of coffee that had grown cold while he stared out the window toward the distant mountains. His expression was thoughtful rather than angry, and Maya sensed that he had spent the sleepless hours wrestling with decisions that had no easy answers. When he finally spoke, his words carried a gravity that made the morning air feel charged with possibility. He told Maya that he had been thinking about her mother during the long night, about the choices Clara had made when she decided to marry a Scottish rancher and leave her people behind. Those choices had required courage that Joseph was only beginning to understand, sacrifices that had shaped every day of their life together. Joseph revealed something he had never told Maya before, that Clara had maintained connections with her Cheyenne relatives throughout their marriage, meeting with them during his business trips to town, exchanging letters through trusted intermediaries, keeping alive relationships that the wider world would not have approved. Her integration into ranch life had been real and complete, but it had never meant abandoning the heritage that had shaped her understanding of the world. Maya listened with growing amazement as her father described a version of her mother she had never known, woman who had navigated between two cultures, with skill and determination, finding ways to honor both without betraying either. Clara's healing knowledge had not been simply personal interest but ancestral wisdom, passed down through generations of women who understood the connections between all living things. The revelation that her mother had maintained contact with Cheyenne relatives opened possibilities Maya had never imagined. Joseph explained that Clara's cousin Thunder Cloud still lived with Red Hawk's band in the foothills beyond Eagle's Rest Valley, serving as a healer and keeper of traditional knowledge. If Maya truly intended to continue her mother's work with healing, perhaps it was time for her to learn from someone who could teach her properly. Maya's heart began racing as she understood what her father was suggesting. The Cheyenne bands in the territory were facing increasing pressure from military forces and civilian authorities who wanted them relocated to distant reservations. Contact with them carried risks that went far beyond the social disapproval that had worried Joseph in the past. But it also represented connection to a heritage that Maya had been denied for too long. Joseph's next words surprised her even more. He explained that he had been considering selling the ranch not because he wanted to escape to California, but because he recognized that their isolated existence was slowly killing both of them. Maya needed connections to a wider world, opportunities to use the gifts her mother had given her, chances to become the woman she was meant to be rather than the diminished version grief had created. The possibility of leaving Pine Ridge territory should have excited Maya, but instead it filled her with panic. Leaving would mean abandoning Silver just when he needed protection most. It would mean walking away from the most meaningful relationship she had developed since her mother's death. The timing felt cruel, just as she was discovering who she might become. Circumstances were conspiring to force choices she was not ready to make. Maya's distress must have been visible in her expression, because Joseph's demeanor shifted toward the gentle understanding she remembered from her childhood. He told her that any decisions about the ranch would wait until spring, that immediate concerns took precedence over long-term planning. Right now, the urgent question was how to protect Silver and his pack from Jake Morrison's hunting ambitions and the general hostility toward wolves throughout the territory. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. A small group of riders was making its way up the valley toward the ranch house, moving with the purposeful pace of people on official business. Maya recognized Sheriff Wade's distinctive gray gelding among them, along with Jake Morrison and two men she didn't know but whose clothing and equipment marked them as professional hunters. Joseph cursed it under his breath and reached for his coat, understanding that the reprieve he had hoped to negotiate for Maya had already ended. Someone had overruled his authority on his own land, had decided that the wolf threat justified immediate action regardless of his wishes. The riders represented forces larger than individual choice, pressures that could not be deflected by reasoned conversation or appeals to property rights. Maya felt something cold and determined settle in her chest as she watched the approaching delegation. These men intended to hunt Silver and his pack, to turn the forest sanctuary where she had discovered healing into a killing ground. They would track the wolves using Jake's knowledge of their location, eliminate them systematically, and collect bounty money for what they would describe as public service. The meeting that followed in the Carsons' front yard was tense and formal, with Sheriff Wade speaking carefully about community safety and territorial regulations. He explained that multiple ranchers had reported livestock losses to wolf predation, that territorial authorities had received requests for assistance in eliminating the threat, that professional hunters had been contracted to resolve the situation permanently. Joseph's protests about property rights and the need for proper investigation fell on deaf ears. The sheriff was clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but bound by regulations that gave him little flexibility. The hunters were eager to begin their work, seeing the wolves as a straightforward problem with a profitable solution. Jake Morrison stood behind them with barely concealed satisfaction, knowing that his discovery of Maya's activities had set these events in motion. Maya listened to the discussion with growing desperation, understanding that legal and rational arguments would not be sufficient to protect Silver. The men gathered in her yard saw wolves as pests to be eliminated rather than intelligent beings worthy of consideration. Their perspective was shaped by practical concerns about livestock and economic interests rather than by any recognition of the complex relationships that existed between humans and the wild world. When Sheriff Wade announced that the hunt would begin immediately, Maya made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped forward and announced that she would guide them to the area where wolves had been sighted, claiming that her knowledge of the terrain would make their search more efficient. The offer was so unexpected and seemingly helpful that no one thought to question her motives. Joseph stared at his daughter with alarm, understanding that she was planning something dangerous but unable to intervene without revealing more about her situation then would be safe. Maya met his gaze steadily, hoping he would trust her enough to allow her this desperate gambit. She had no clear plan beyond reaching Silver before the hunters did, but she knew that staying behind would mean watching helplessly as the wolves were systematically destroyed. The hunting party accepted Maya's offer with the condescending gratitude men typically showed when women proposed to help with serious business. They assumed that her familiarity with local trails would be useful for transportation, but that she would remain safely distant from any actual confrontation with dangerous animals. Maya encouraged their assumptions while privately preparing for actions that would shock them completely. The ride toward the line shack took nearly an hour, giving Maya time to observe the hunters and assess their capabilities. They were competent and well-equipped, carrying rifles and tracking equipment that spoke of professional experience. More troubling, they approached their task with the detached efficiency of men who had eliminated many wolf packs and felt no emotional connection to their targets. As they approached the area where Silver had been calling the previous night, Maya began to hear sounds that filled her with both hope and terror. Howls echoed through the forest from multiple directions, suggesting that the pack had grown larger than she had realized. Silver was not alone among strangers, but surrounded by family, part of a complex social group that had accepted him back after his long absence. The hunters heard the howls too and reacted with the focused attention of professionals who had found their quarry. They began discussing strategy and positioning, planning an approach that would allow them to eliminate as many wolves as possible before the pack could scatter. Their conversation was clinical and methodical, treating the deaths they planned to cause as simple technical problems requiring efficient solutions. Maya's heart was pounding as she realized that her desperate plan to warn Silver might have led the hunters directly to the entire pack. Her attempt to protect him could result in a massacre that would destroy not just Silver, but the entire family. He had rejoined. The weight of responsibility for whatever happened next settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. The moment came when Maya had to choose between her own safety and Silver's survival. As the hunters dismounted and began preparing their weapons, she quietly separated herself from the group and moved toward the area where the howls seemed strongest. Her plan was simple and probably suicidal: reach Silver before the hunters found him, warn him somehow, and trust that his intelligence would allow him to understand the danger. She had traveled perhaps 50 yards through the trees when she heard a sound that stopped her completely. A voice was calling in a language she recognized but had never heard, spoken fluently, Cheyenne words that carried across the forest with authority and purpose. Maya's blood seemed to freeze as she realized that the hunting party was not the only group of humans in the forest that morning. The voice belonged to a man who emerged from behind a stand of pine trees with the silent grace of someone who had spent his entire life moving through wilderness. He was Cheyenne, probably in his 40s, with long dark hair and clothes that combined traditional elements with practical frontier additions. Most importantly, he was not alone. Several other figures became visible among the trees, positioned with strategic precision around the area where the wolves had been calling. Maya found herself caught between two groups of armed men with conflicting intentions, her presence potentially dangerous to everyone involved. The hunters behind her were preparing to kill wolves for bounty money. The Cheyenne ahead of her seemed to be protecting the same animals. Maya was the unwitting link between them, the person whose actions had brought these forces into collision. The Cheyenne man who had spoken approached her with careful movements that communicated peaceful intentions while maintaining readiness for conflict. When he spoke to her in accented English, his voice carried a quality of calm authority that reminded Maya painfully of her mother's descriptions of her own relatives. He asked her name and her purpose in the forest, questions that seemed simple but carried implications Maya was only beginning to understand. Maya's response was instinctive and honest. She told him her name and her mother's name, explained that Clara Carson had been born Thundercloud's cousin, described her desperate attempt to protect a wolf she had rescued and healed. The man's expression shifted dramatically as she spoke, recognition and understanding replacing caution and suspicion. He introduced himself as Red Hawk, leader of the band that included Thundercloud among its members. Maya's mother had been more than just his cousin. She had been like a sister, someone whose loss had been mourned deeply by people Maya had never known cared about her family. Red Hawk's presence in the forest was not coincidental but purposeful, based on information that had reached his people through networks Maya was only beginning to discover. Red Hawk explained that Thundercloud had been having dreams about Clara's daughter, visions that suggested Maya was in danger and needed protection. The old woman had sent scouts to watch the Carson ranch from a distance to ensure that Clara's child was safe and to offer help if circumstances required it. Maya's activities with Silver had been observed and reported, her desperate situation understood by people who shared her respect for the connections between humans and animals. The wolves Maya had been trying to protect were known to Red Hawks, people who considered them relatives rather than threats. The pack included animals that had been born near the Cheyenne winter camps, that had grown up with minimal fear of humans who treated them with respect and understanding. Silver's injury and separation from his family had been noted, his disappearance a source of concern for people who monitored the well-being of all creatures in their territory. Maya's rescue and healing of Silver had not been an isolated act of compassion but part of a larger story that connected her to heritage she had never fully understood. Her mother's teachings about healing had not been simply personal knowledge, but traditional wisdom that carried responsibilities and connections. Maya was only beginning to comprehend. The sound of the hunters moving through the forest reminded them all that immediate danger remained. Red Hawk's people were prepared to defend the wolves if necessary, but conflict with territorial authorities would have consequences that extended far beyond the current situation. The Cheyenne were already under pressure to relocate to distant reservations, and any violence would provide justification for harsher measures. Maya found herself in a position to influence events that could affect many lives beyond her own. Her decision to guide the hunters had been intended to protect Silver, but it had created a situation where her choices might determine whether the mourning ended in bloodshed or peaceful resolution. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. Red Hawk studied Maya's face with the careful attention of someone trying to assess both capability and commitment. When he finally spoke, his words carried an invitation that would change everything about her understanding of her own identity and future. He told her that Thundercloud had been hoping to meet Clara's daughter for years, that there were things about her heritage that needed to be shared and honored. More immediately, Red Hawk explained that Maya could help prevent violence by convincing the hunters that the wolves had moved beyond their reach. Her knowledge of the terrain and her established relationship with the hunting party gave her unique ability to misdirect their search without arousing suspicion. It would require deception and courage, but it could save lives both human and animal. Maya's choice was clear, even if the consequences were not. She agreed to Red Hawk's plan and made her way back toward the hunters, her mind racing with strategies for leading them away from the wolves without revealing her true intentions. The performance she was about to give would require all her mother's skills at navigating between different worlds, all her own newfound understanding of courage and commitment. The hunters were growing impatient when Maya rejoined them, their frustration with the terrain and the apparently elusive wolves making them eager for any guidance she could provide. Maya told them that the howls had been echoing confusingly through the trees, that she believed the pack had moved toward the eastern ridges where the wind patterns would make tracking more difficult. Her suggestion was plausible enough to be accepted without question, and the hunting party began moving in the direction she indicated. Maya led them on a careful route that took them steadily away from the area where Red Hawk's people were protecting the wolves, buying time and distance. That could mean the difference between massacre and survival. The deception required constant vigilance and careful performance. Maya had to appear helpful and knowledgeable while actually undermining the hunters' efforts, had to maintain their confidence while ensuring their failure. The strain of maintaining such complex falsehood was exhausting, but the alternative was unthinkable. By late afternoon, the hunters had become thoroughly frustrated with their lack of success. The wolf sign they had been following seemed to disappear entirely in the rocky terrain Maya had led them to, and their professional confidence was beginning to erode. Sheriff Wade was particularly unhappy with the wasted time and resources, clearly regretting his decision to organize the hunt based on Jake Morrison's enthusiastic reports. Maya seized on their discouragement to suggest that the wolves had probably moved far beyond the immediate area, perhaps traveling toward distant mountains where pursuit would be impractical. Her performance of disappointment at their failure was convincing enough to deflect suspicion while encouraging the hunters to abandon their efforts for the day. The ride back to the Carson Ranch was subdued, with the hunters discussing whether to continue their efforts or report that the wolf threat had been eliminated by the animal's departure from the territory. Maya maintained her facade of helpful concern while privately celebrating the success of her deception. Silver and his pack had gained at least temporary safety, and she had discovered capabilities within herself that she had never known existed. Joseph Carson was waiting anxiously when the hunting party returned empty-handed. His relief at seeing Maya unharmed was obvious, though he was clearly puzzled by the failed hunt and his daughter's role in it. Maya met his gaze steadily, hoping he would understand that explanations would have to wait until they were alone. The hunters departed with grudging thanks for Maya's assistance, their frustration tempered by Sheriff Wade's obvious desire to avoid further complications. Jake Morrison's disappointment was particularly visible, his hopes for bounty money and validation of his tracking skills thoroughly disappointed. Maya watched them ride away with satisfaction that felt both triumphant and precarious. That evening, as Maya told her father about her encounter with Red Hawk and the protection of Silver's pack, she saw recognition and understanding dawn in Joseph's eyes. The connections her mother had maintained with her Cheyenne relatives had not been broken by death but had been waiting for the right moment to be renewed. Maya's actions had not just saved Silver, but had opened pathways to heritage and community that had been lost for too long. Joseph's response surprised Maya with its decisiveness and clarity. He told her that Red Hawk's invitation to meet Thunder Cloud was not just an opportunity, but a responsibility that honored her mother's memory. The ranch would survive without them for whatever time was needed, and Maya's education in her full heritage was more important than the daily routines that had sustained them through their period of grief. The decision to accept Red Hawk's invitation felt both monumental and inevitable. Maya would leave the isolated world of the Carson Ranch to discover connections that her mother had cherished but been forced to keep secret. She would learn healing traditions that went far beyond the fragments she had inherited, would find her place in a community that understood the bonds between humans and the wild world. But most importantly, she would be reunited with Silver, in circumstances that honored rather than threatened their relationship. The wolf who had given her back her sense of purpose would become part of a larger story about belonging and heritage that stretched back through generations of women who had understood what Maya was only beginning to learn. The morning Maya left the ranch with Red Hawk, she looked back only once at the buildings that had contained her entire world for 16 years. They looked smaller than she remembered, like structures that had served their purpose but were no longer adequate for the person she was becoming. Joseph stood on the porch watching her go, his expression mixing pride and worry in proportions that spoke of love stronger than fear. The journey to the Cheyenne winter camp took most of the day, following trails that existed more in memory than in physical marking. Red Hawk proved to be a patient guide and thoughtful companion, sharing stories about Maya's mother that revealed a young woman of remarkable courage and wisdom. Clara had been someone who built bridges between worlds, rather than choosing sides, who found ways to honor multiple heritages without betraying any of them. Thundercloud was waiting when they arrived at the camp, an elderly woman whose eyes held depths of knowledge that reminded Maya immediately of her mother. The reunion was emotional and profound, filled with recognition that transcended the years of separation. Thundercloud embraced Maya, as if welcoming home a daughter who had been lost but never forgotten. The days that followed were unlike anything Maya had ever experienced. She learned healing songs that had been sung for generations, discovered the stories behind the plant medicines her mother had taught her to use, understood for the first time the complex relationships that connected all living things in an intricate web of mutual dependence and respect. Most wonderfully, Silver was a frequent visitor to the winter camp, accepted by Red Hawk's people as family rather than threat. The Wolf's recovery had been complete, not just physically but socially, his reintegration into his pack seamless and natural. Maya watched him play with the wolf pups and hunt with the adults, understanding that her healing had restored him to a full life rather than mere survival. The bond between Maya and Silver remained strong despite his return to wild life. He would often approach her when she was gathering plants or practicing healing techniques, offering companionship that needed no explanation or justification. Their relationship had evolved from nurse and patient to something more complex and enduring, a friendship that bridged species and honored the connections that existed beneath the surface of apparent differences. Thundercloud explained to Maya that such relationships were not unusual among her mother's people, that the boundaries between human and animal worlds were more fluid than the dominant culture acknowledged. Maya's gift for healing extended beyond technical knowledge to include an intuitive understanding of the spirit that animated all living things. This was heritage as much as the songs and medicines, wisdom that could not be taught but only recognized and honored. As winter gradually gave way to spring, Maya faced decisions about her future that were more complex than simple choice between ranch life and Cheyenne community. Red Hawk's people would soon be forced to relocate to distant reservations, their traditional life in Pine Ridge territory ending under pressure from territorial authorities and military forces. Maya could accompany them into exile or return to the ranch and the limited but secure life her father could provide. But Thundercloud suggested a third possibility that had not occurred to Maya. The old woman spoke of the need for bridges between communities that were being forced apart by historical forces beyond individual control. Maya's heritage and capabilities positioned her uniquely to serve as a healer who could work with both white and Cheyenne communities, someone who understood multiple traditions and could help preserve knowledge that was being lost. The vision Thundercloud described was challenging and uncertain, requiring Maya to navigate prejudices and misunderstandings from multiple directions. But it also represented a way of honoring her mother's legacy while using her own gifts in service of something larger than personal satisfaction. Maya would not have to choose between her heritages, but could find ways to honor both while helping others bridge similar divides. The decision, when it finally crystallized, felt both surprising and inevitable. Maya would return to Pine Ridge territory, but not to the isolation of ranch life. She would establish herself as a healer serving the scattered communities throughout the region, using her knowledge to help both humans and animals while maintaining connections to Thundercloud and traditional Cheyenne wisdom. Joseph Carson's reaction to his daughter's plan was complex but ultimately supportive. He had seen Maya transform during her time with Red Hawk's people, had witnessed her growth into someone who carried herself with confidence and purpose that had been missing since her mother's death. The life she was proposing was unconventional and potentially dangerous, but it was also authentic in ways that their previous existence had not been. The small cabin Maya established near Copper Falls, became a place where people came seeking help that conventional medicine could not provide. Her reputation spread gradually through networks of people who understood the value of healing that addressed spirit as well as body. She treated injured animals and sick children, broken bones and broken hearts, always remembering her mother's teaching that true healing required attention to connections rather than just symptoms. Silver remained a frequent companion in her new life, often appearing at the cabin when she was treating particularly difficult cases. His presence seemed to calm both human and animal patients, creating an atmosphere of peace that enhanced the effectiveness of her healing work. The wolf who had first taught her about the power of compassion continued to be her teacher and partner in ways that defied conventional understanding. The story of Maya and Silver became part of the oral tradition kept alive by Thundercloud and other storytellers, a tale that illustrated the possibilities that existed when different worlds came together with respect and understanding. Their relationship served as a reminder that healing was not just about fixing what was broken, but about recognizing and honoring the connections that made all life possible. Years later, when Maya had become known throughout the territory as someone who could heal what others could not, she would still sometimes sit beside Copper Falls and remember the morning she had found Silver bleeding in the snow beside Willow Creek. That moment of choice had changed everything about her understanding of who she was and what she was meant to become. The wounded wolf had taught her that sometimes saving another's life was really about discovering your own, that the deepest healing came from connection rather than isolation, and that love could bridge any distance between different worlds. Silver lived to an old age for a wolf, his pack thriving in the protected valleys where Red Hawk's people had once lived. He never lost his special relationship with Maya, visiting her regularly until the day he died peacefully beside her cabin. With his great head resting in her lap, Maya buried him overlooking Copper Falls, marking his grave with stones arranged in patterns Thundercloud had taught her, honoring a friend who had shown her the way home to herself. The legacy of their relationship lived on in the stories told around winter fires, in the healing traditions passed from teacher to student, in the understanding that compassion could transform the world one life at a time. Maya Carson had found her pack among people who understood that healing was not just a skill, but a calling, that love was not limited by species or culture, and that sometimes the greatest adventures began with the simple decision to help someone who needed it more than you feared the consequences. 25 years had passed since Maya first found Silver bleeding in the snow beside Willow Creek, and the world around Pine Ridge Territory had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The railroad had finally reached the valley, bringing with it settlers who transformed the landscape with their farms and towns. The great cattle drives that had once defined the territory's economy had given way to smaller ranches and agricultural communities that carved order from what had once been endless wilderness. Maya stood on the porch of her expanded cabin near Copper Falls, watching the morning mist rise from the water like the breath of sleeping spirits. Her hair, now streaked with silver that caught the early light, was braided in the traditional style Thundercloud had taught her decades ago. The hands that had once trembled while treating Silver's wounds now moved with the confident grace of someone who had spent years healing both humans and animals, bridging worlds that others still believed could never meet. The cabin itself had grown over the years into something that reflected Maya's unique position between communities. The original structure remained at its heart, but additions had been built in both frontier and Cheyenne styles, creating a home that welcomed visitors from every background. The main room served as both living space and healing center, its walls lined with herbs and medicines gathered from traditions that spanned continents and generations. On this particular morning, Maya was expecting visitors who would test everything she had learned about bringing different worlds together. A delegation from the territorial capital was coming to investigate reports of her healing practices, prompted by complaints from some of the newer settlers who viewed her methods with suspicion and fear. At the same time, Little Fox, who had grown into one of the most respected leaders among the relocated Cheyenne, was arriving with elders who needed to discuss the preservation of traditional knowledge in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to their ways. The convergence was not coincidental. Maya had learned that sometimes the most important healing happened when conflicts were brought into the open rather than allowed to fester in darkness. Today would require all her skills not just as a healer, but as a bridge between communities that had grown more distant even as the physical distances between them had shrunk. She moved through her morning routine with the deliberate calm that had become second nature over the years. Water was drawn from the spring that fed Copper Falls. The same spring thundercloud had shown her how to approach with proper respect and gratitude. Herbs were selected for the day's preparations, each plant chosen not just for its medicinal properties, but for its spiritual significance in the work she would be undertaking. As Maya worked, her thoughts drifted to the letters she had received over the past months, missives that revealed the growing tension surrounding her practice. Some came from grateful families whose children she had healed when conventional medicine had failed. Others arrived from territorial officials who questioned the legitimacy of treatments that could not be explained through established scientific principles. The most troubling communications came from religious leaders who saw her integration of Cheyenne spiritual practices as a threat to Christian civilization in the territory. The complexity of her situation would have been overwhelming, if not for the foundation of confidence she had built through years of successful healing. Maya had learned to trust the knowledge Thundercloud had shared with her, to rely on instincts that connected her to wisdom older than the conflicts that currently threatened her work. She had also learned that courage was not the absence of fear but the willingness to act correctly despite being afraid. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the valley below, where two separate groups were making their way toward her cabin along different trails. The territorial delegation approached from the east, following the main road that connected her home to the growing town of Pine Ridge. Their procession included an official carriage and several mounted escorts, the kind of formal display that announced government business to anyone watching. From the north, following paths that were invisible to untrained eyes, came Little Fox and the Cheyenne elders. They rode with the fluid grace of people who had grown up on horseback, their approach so quiet that only someone who knew what to look for would notice their presence. The contrast between the two groups could not have been more stark, yet both were coming to Maya for reasons that were more similar than either side would acknowledge. Maya finished her preparations and changed into clothing that reflected her dual heritage, a dress that combined practical frontier styling with beadwork and decorative elements that honored her Cheyenne training. The combination was deliberate, a visual statement about the integration she had achieved in her own life and hoped to facilitate for the wider community. The territorial delegation arrived first, their leader a stern-faced man named Commissioner Barnes, who had been sent from the capital to investigate what officials described as irregular medical practices in the Pine Ridge region. He was accompanied by Dr. Harrison, a trained physician who had recently established a practice in town, and Reverend Matthews, whose church served many of the newer settlers and who had been vocal in his opposition to what he called pagan healing rituals. Maya greeted them with the formal courtesy that frontier hospitality demanded, offering refreshments and comfortable seating on her porch while they discussed their concerns. Commissioner Barnes was direct in his questioning, asking about her training, her methods, and the basis for treatments that seemed to achieve results conventional medicine could not explain. Dr. Harrison's approach was more scholarly, genuinely curious about techniques he had observed but could not understand. He described cases where his own treatments had failed, only to have patients recover completely after visiting Maya's cabin. His scientific training made him skeptical of methods that could not be replicated in controlled conditions, but his medical ethics prevented him from dismissing results that clearly benefited his patients. Reverend Matthews was less diplomatic in his concerns. He spoke bluntly about the spiritual dangers he perceived in Maya's integration of what he called heathen practices with legitimate healing work. His objections were not primarily medical but theological, based on beliefs about proper Christian behavior and the risks of exposing territorial residents to influences he considered corrupting. Maya listened to their concerns with the patience. Thundercloud had taught her, understanding that each man's perspective reflected genuine beliefs about what was best for the community. She answered their questions honestly, explaining how her methods combined knowledge from multiple traditions, describing the careful attention to both physical and spiritual aspects of healing that made her treatments effective. As their conversation continued, the second group of visitors made their quiet approach through the forest. Little Fox and the 3 elders with him moved with the stealth that had allowed their people to survive decades of pressure and persecution. Their arrival at the cabin was so subtle that the territorial officials did not notice until Little Fox stepped onto the porch with a greeting that acknowledged Maya's other guests without showing deference to their authority. The moment of tension that followed was exactly what Maya had been preparing for throughout her years of bridge building. Here, on her own porch, representatives of 2 worlds that viewed each other with suspicion and hostility were being asked to share space and perhaps find common ground. The success or failure of the encounter would depend on her ability to help each side recognize the humanity and legitimate concerns of the other. Little Fox's presence immediately shifted the dynamics of the conversation. Commissioner Barnes was clearly uncomfortable with the unexpected addition of Cheyenne representatives to what he had intended as an official investigation. Dr. Harrison was curious about the traditional healing knowledge that Little Fox might possess. Reverend Matthews was openly hostile, viewing the arrival of what he considered pagans as confirmation of his worst fears about Maya's practices. Maya seized the moment to reframe their gathering, suggesting that the unexpected convergence provided an opportunity for dialogue that could benefit everyone present. She proposed that instead of conducting separate conversations about healing practices, they might explore how different approaches to health and wellness could complement rather than compete with each other. The suggestion was met with varying degrees of enthusiasm and skepticism, but Maya pressed forward with the confidence that came from years of successful mediation between communities. She began by acknowledging the legitimate concerns each group had raised, demonstrating her understanding of their different perspectives, while gradually revealing the common ground that existed beneath surface disagreements. Commissioner Barnes was primarily concerned with maintaining order and ensuring that territorial residents received safe and effective medical care. Dr. Harrison wanted to understand and potentially learn from healing methods that achieved results his training could not explain. Reverend Matthews sought to protect his congregation from spiritual influences he believed were dangerous. Little Fox and the elders were working to preserve traditional knowledge, while adapting to a changing world that increasingly threatened their cultural survival. Maya pointed out that all of these concerns shared a fundamental commitment to the well-being of people in the territory. The disagreements were about methods and approaches rather than about ultimate goals. Her own practice had succeeded precisely because it found ways to honor multiple traditions while serving the practical needs of everyone who sought her help. To demonstrate her point, Maya invited her guests to observe her work with a patient who was expected that afternoon. Mrs. Elizabeth Turner was bringing her young son Robert, who had been suffering from seizures that Dr. Harrison had been unable to treat effectively. The case would provide an opportunity for everyone present to see how Maya's integrated approach actually worked in practice. Mrs. Turner arrived with obvious nervousness, clearly surprised to find such a large and diverse group gathered at Maya's cabin. She had been coming to Maya for help with various family health concerns for several years, but always in the privacy that protected both of them from community judgment. The presence of territorial officials and religious leaders created a situation that felt dangerous for reasons she could not articulate. Maya's handling of Mrs. Turner's anxiety provided the first demonstration of her diplomatic skills for the assembled observers. She spoke to the worried mother with gentle reassurance, explaining the presence of the various visitors in terms that emphasized their shared concern for Robert's well-being. Mrs. Turner's visible relaxation under Maya's care was itself a form of healing that the observers could not help but notice. Young Robert was 8 years old, small for his age, with the pale complexion and careful movements of a child who had learned to live with unpredictable illness. His seizures had begun 6 months earlier, occurring with increasing frequency. Despite Dr. Harrison's careful treatment with the latest medicines available through territorial supply channels, the boy's condition was deteriorating, and his family was desperate for help from any source. Maya's examination of Robert proceeded methodically, combining techniques that Dr. Harrison recognized with approaches that were completely foreign to his training. She checked the boy's pulse and reflexes with the precision of trained medical practice, but she also observed aspects of his condition that conventional medicine did not typically consider important: the quality of his breathing, the color and texture of his skin, subtle indicators of spiritual as well as physical distress. The treatment that followed was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of how different healing traditions could work together rather than in opposition. Maya used conventional medicines to address Robert's immediate symptoms, but she also employed traditional plant preparations that Thundercloud had taught her to use for seizure disorders. Most importantly, she incorporated spiritual element songs and ceremonies that addressed what she believed were the deeper causes of the boy's illness. Dr. Harrison watched the proceedings with intense interest, asking detailed questions about the plant medicines and their preparation. Some of the ingredients were familiar to him from his medical training, while others were completely unknown despite his years of study. Maya's explanations revealed a sophisticated understanding of how different substances work together to achieve therapeutic effects that no single component could produce alone. Reverend Matthews was more troubled by the spiritual aspects of Maya's treatment, particularly the songs that she sang while preparing medicines and the ritual elements that seemed to invoke powers he could not identify with Christian practice. His discomfort was obvious, but he remained silent out of respect for Mrs. Turner's desperation and her clear belief in Maya's ability to help her son. Little Fox and the elders observed the treatment with recognition and approval, seeing in Maya's work a faithful continuation of traditions they had feared might be lost forever. Her integration of plant knowledge with spiritual practice reflected teachings that went back generations, adapted for circumstances they could never have imagined, but maintaining essential elements that connected healing to larger understanding about the relationships between all living things. The most remarkable aspect of the treatment was its immediate effectiveness. Robert's seizures had been occurring multiple times each day, but within hours of receiving Maya's care, his symptoms began to subside dramatically. The improvement was visible to everyone present, impossible to dismiss as coincidence or wishful thinking. Dr. Harrison was particularly struck by the rapid change, which exceeded anything he had achieved through conventional treatment. As the afternoon progressed and Robert's condition continued to improve, the atmosphere among Maya's visitors shifted from skepticism and suspicion towards something approaching wonder. Commissioner Barnes found himself asking practical questions about how Maya's methods might be integrated with territorial health services. Dr. Harrison was taking detailed notes about plant preparations and treatment protocols he hoped to understand more fully. Even Reverend Matthews was struggling to reconcile his theological objections with the undeniable evidence of healing taking place before his eyes. The conversation that followed Robert's treatment was unlike anything Maya had experienced in her years of bridge building between communities. For the first time, representatives from different worlds were genuinely listening to each other, asking questions motivated by curiosity rather than suspicion, exploring possibilities for cooperation rather than defending positions of opposition. Dr. Harrison was the first to acknowledge what everyone was thinking. He admitted that Maya's results exceeded what conventional medicine could achieve alone, and he expressed interest in learning more about traditional healing methods that might complement his own training. His scientific approach to the question helped legitimize the discussion for Commissioner Barnes, who began exploring practical questions about regulation and standards. Reverend Matthews struggled more with the implications of what he had witnessed, but his pastoral concern for his congregation eventually outweighed his theological objections. He spoke haltingly about the possibility that God might work through traditions other than those he had been taught to recognize, opening a space for spiritual understanding that was larger than any single religious framework. Little Fox and the elders were cautiously optimistic about the potential for greater acceptance of traditional healing practices, but they also raised important concerns about protecting sacred knowledge from exploitation or misuse. Their willingness to share some information reflected trust in Maya's judgment and respect for her role as a bridge between communities, but they emphasized the need for safeguards that would preserve the integrity of traditional practices. The discussions continued into the evening, covering topics that ranged from practical questions about training and certification to philosophical explorations of different approaches to understanding health and illness. Maya found herself facilitating conversations that would have been impossible just hours earlier, helping people from radically different backgrounds find common ground around shared commitment to healing and community well-being. By the time her visitors prepared to leave, tentative agreements had been reached that could transform healing practices throughout the territory. Dr. Harrison would work with Maya to document traditional plant medicines and develop protocols that combined conventional and traditional approaches. Commissioner Barnes would explore regulatory frameworks that could legitimize Maya's practices, while maintaining appropriate standards for public safety. Most significantly, Reverend Matthews agreed to meet with Thunder, Cloud, and other spiritual leaders to explore theological questions about the relationship between different forms of spiritual practice. His willingness to engage seriously with traditions he had previously dismissed represented a breakthrough that could reduce religious opposition to traditional healing throughout the territory. The agreements reached that day were fragile and would require careful nurturing to survive the inevitable challenges ahead. But Maya had learned that even small steps toward understanding could create momentum for larger changes, that bridges built carefully between communities could eventually support traffic in both directions. In the weeks that followed, Maya's cabin became an unofficial center for collaboration between different healing traditions. Dr. Harrison made regular visits to learn about plant medicines and treatment approaches that enhanced his own practice. Students from Thundercloud's teachings worked alongside territorial medical apprentices, sharing knowledge that benefited everyone involved. The changes were not without controversy. Some territorial residents remained suspicious of traditional healing methods, while some Cheyenne elders worried about the dilution of sacred practices through contact with outsider traditions. Maya found herself constantly mediating between different concerns, using skills she had developed through years of careful diplomacy, but the results spoke for themselves. Patients throughout the territory were receiving more effective treatment than had ever been available before. Children like Robert Turner were recovering from conditions that had previously been considered untreatable. Families were learning to care for themselves using knowledge that connected them to the natural world around them. Most importantly, the success of the healing collaboration was creating space for other forms of cooperation between communities that had been separated by suspicion and misunderstanding. Trading relationships developed between Cheyenne craftspeople and territorial merchants. Educational exchanges allowed young people from different backgrounds to learn from each other. Cultural celebrations began to include participants from multiple communities, creating shared experiences that built understanding across traditional boundaries. Maya's role in these developments was sometimes visible and sometimes hidden, but always essential. She had learned that effective bridge building required constant attention to the concerns of all parties involved, careful navigation of sensitivities that could destroy trust if handled carelessly. Her success came from genuine respect for every tradition she worked with, combined with unwavering commitment to finding solutions that served the well-being of everyone in the territory. As winter approached, Maya often found herself thinking about Silver and the moment that had changed her understanding of what was possible in the world. The wounded wolf had taught her that healing was not just about fixing what was broken, but about recognizing and nurturing the connections that made all life possible. That lesson had guided everything she had accomplished in the years since, from her early work as a healer to her current role as a bridge between communities. The legacy of her relationship with Silver lived on in ways both practical and spiritual. The healing techniques she had learned while nursing him back to health had evolved into methods that helped humans and animals throughout the territory. The trust that had developed between them had become a model for building relationships across species and cultural boundaries. Most importantly, the recognition that different forms of life could support and enrich each other had become the foundation for everything she continued to work toward. On quiet evenings when the mist rose from Copper Falls and the forest grew still with approaching night, Maya could sometimes hear howls echoing across the valley from the distant mountains, where Silver's descendants still roamed free. The sound carried memories of amber eyes and gentle trust, of a friendship that had transcended every boundary others believed could not be crossed. The wolves' calls reminded Maya that the work of building connections between different worlds was never finished, that each generation had to learn anew how to recognize the bonds that made healing and growth possible. Her own contribution to that ongoing work had been shaped by a chance encounter with a wounded animal beside a frozen creek, but the principles she had learned applied to every relationship that required courage, patience, and willingness to see beyond surface differences. The cabin near Copper Falls had become more than a home or a healing center. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose connection over separation, understanding over fear, love over suspicion. Visitors came not just for medical treatment but for the hope that Maya's life represented, proof that different worlds could meet and enrich each other, that bridges could be built across any divide if people were willing to do the careful work of understanding. Maya knew that her own time as a bridge builder would eventually end, but she had trained others to continue the work she had begun. Students from multiple traditions had learned not just healing techniques, but the diplomatic skills necessary to navigate between different communities. The principles that had guided her life: respect for all forms of knowledge, commitment to serving everyone in need, willingness to take risks for the sake of greater understanding, were being passed on to people who would face their own challenges in an ever-changing world. The story that had begun with a young woman and a wounded wolf had become something larger than either of them could have imagined. It had become a demonstration of what was possible when compassion overcame fear, when people chose to see connections rather than differences, when healing was understood as something that could transform not just individuals, but entire communities. As Maya prepared for sleep on this anniversary of her first meeting with Silver, she offered a prayer of gratitude that Thundercloud had taught her years earlier. She gave thanks for the wounded wolf who had shown her the way to her true calling, for the elders who had shared their wisdom, for the patients who had trusted her with their healing, for the officials and religious leaders who had found the courage to set aside their prejudices in service of greater understanding. Most of all, she gave thanks for the recognition that every ending was also a beginning, that every act of healing created possibilities for more healing, that love expressed in service to others was the force that could transform the world one relationship at a time. The mist rising from Copper Falls carried her prayers toward the stars, where Silver's spirit ran free with the eternal pact that welcomed all souls who had learned to bridge the distances between different forms of life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve the growing community that had formed around her work. But tonight, Maya rested in the peace that came from knowing that her life had honored the gifts she had received, that the connection she had helped create would continue to grow long after her own time had passed, that the love between a frontier girl and a wounded wolf had become part of a story that would be told as long as people remembered that healing was possible across any divide. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.